Hello.
Oh. So I'm going to continue with this in a different direction after that powerful talk that Dallas just gave, with this idea of using analogies, what works and what doesn't, and what's real and what isn't. And I think it really, in a different way, will play off. But I do want to say that I really am, I'm not just saying this, but I am honored to sit on a panel with two people who I admire so much and have influenced me so much. It's somewhat humbling. I'm going to look at the analogy, the racial analogies and the rhetoric of race that's often used in the animal liberation rights movement. People who advocate for non-human animals sometimes face hostility and ridicule from a public who assumes that showing concern for animals indicates a lack of concern for humans, as if the two can't coexist. In response, activists make direct connections amongst oppressions, arguing that animal and human oppressions are allied, even equal. While Holocaust, genocide, and slavery are used in animal liberation rhetoric, skeptical audiences are often hostile to expressions that attempt to expose animal exploitation through the filter of human suffering. They are more willing to acknowledge animal abuse, but often unwilling, as Dallas noted, if it remains differentiated from that of humans, because in a speciesist world, human suffering matters more. Nevertheless, if attended to appropriately, these correlations can guide people to more compassionate perceptions of non-humans. But first, the concept of speciesism needs greater integration into popular vernacular. And I'm sure everyone here knows what speciesism is, but I'll still just say it's valuing the needs of one's own species over another. It's the simplest way to put it. To best understand the dreaded comparisons, I want to start with just some basic terminology. What do words mean? So, such as Holocaust, genocide, and slavery. Slavery is almost as old as humankind, as is the ethnocentric or clan mentality leading to the Holocaust of World War II. Initially, Holocaust indicated a sacrifice by fire, and has also come to indicate the intentional annihilation of a group of people. Slavery indicates that one is the legal property of another. Animals are legal property today, of course. They are slaughtered en masse, and they are compelled into submission by dominating forces. But their destruction is not toward the ultimate goal of annihilating, this is a quote, in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, which is how the United Nations General Assembly defined genocide 4 years after World War II. Non-humans are destroyed by the billions on a yearly basis, not because their oppressors hate them, but because of indifference. In a 1999 speech, renowned author and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel explored the import of this word indifference. This is a quote, "Of course, indifference can be tempting, more than that, seductive. It is so much easier to look away from victims." And again, here's that correlation. It is so much easier to avoid such rude interruptions into our work, our dreams, our hopes. It is, after all, awkward, troublesome. To be involved in another person's pain, their hidden or even visible anguish is of no interest. Indifference reduces the other to an abstraction, end quote. Hatred caused the mass killing of Jews during World War II. Nazis were not indifferent to the Jews' fate, yet indifference manifested through worldwide refusal to acknowledge that genocide, with German citizens going about their lives and other countries ignoring rumors of extermination camps or denying admittance to Jewish refugees. But as a wonderful co-editor brought to my attention, there had to be some level of hatred there as well to ignore the genocide and the ways that the rest of the world responded. So those terms aren't so easily differentiated. Those who eat animals are not acting like Nazis, who exemplify an extreme case of human degeneracy. Rather, they seem to be acting like average humans who follow the standard social mores of their society without question. Food industry animals are not destroyed because profit makers want to eradicate them. Rather, they're bred and destroyed by industries that must keep producing them to make money. Generations of sentient beings are born so that another species can slaughter and ingest them. In this way, the trans-species comparisons, while sometimes suitable, are far from ideal. As Melanie Joyce states very directly in Strategic Action for Animals, animal liberation is not human liberation. The animal liberation movement differs from other social movements in 3 ways, and this is Joy's paraphrase. First, the public has a personal investment in maintaining a species' culture. Secondly, animals do not have human voices, but of course they have voices. I don't like that idea of voice and voiceless, with which they can attest to their abuse. And lastly, animals are property in the legal sense. Joy's first and last points could apply to blacks during American slavery. Southern Americans and Northerners as well had personal and financial investments in preserving the slave trade, and their slaves were legal goods. However, as humans, African Americans could speak their oppressor's language. They could bear witness to atrocities perpetrated against them. And even during the slave trade's peak, slaves were declared to be 3/5 persons. When the myths of racial difference were challenged, some individuals would not, and still don't renounce their bigotry, of course. Yet that remaining prejudice does nothing to assuage the reality that there is little to nothing besides external characteristics that differentiate one group of human being from another. We're all Homo sapiens. But other animals are not, and we eat them. We also wear their skin, and their material derivatives surround us. This is unique in the history of oppression. As an animal advocate, I don't seek elevated legal status for oppressed beings so that they may share cultural space with their past subjugators, as is the case with many historical human liberation movements. Of course, there are exceptions, thinking of Marcus Garvey's Black Star Line Back to Africa movement, in which he called for a return to Africa away from Western colonizers. George Fredrickson argues that racism is ultimately about difference in power, and the concept of racism, a term we now apply to centuries-old injustices, did not develop until the early 20th century as an actual concept and a word that people used. It came into common usage in the 1930s when a new word was required to describe the theories on which the Nazis based their persecution of the Jews. When contemporary activists appropriate the terminology of human oppression to inform the public of animal oppression, they may offend or confuse their audiences who do not yet understand this concept of speciesism. C. Richard King asserts that when activists use the dreaded comparisons, they are, quote, literally trading upon past horrors and dehumanization in hopes of securing rights in the present. In this context, the marginalized, maligned, and maimed compete with one another claims of injury and victimization. A perverse combat takes shape, known colloquially as the Oppression Olympics, end quote. And that was a term that was coined by a Chicana feminist, Elizabeth Martinez, in the early 90s. In a speciesist culture, humans will always win the gold medal in the Oppression Olympics. Thus, loaded trans-species terminologies attempt to shed light on animals' current woes without showing any understanding of the historical and contextual circumstances of other oppressed groups. I'm not claiming the comparisons invalid in every situation, but acknowledging their limits and looking for ways to make those powerful associations more nuanced and productive. So I want to talk a little bit about the dreaded comparisons in praxis, how they've actually manifest in personal and national campaigns and experience. A few years ago, I was leafleting anti-rodeo pamphlets in Minneapolis, offering the literature to a man and 2 women. The 2 women explained that they opposed rodeos, which I was happy to hear. Their companion, an African-American man, did the same, and he explained why by shouting back to me as he walked away. This was such a great quote. I'm against the rodeo because there was a time when black people were treated like those animals. We were the rodeo. And there it was, the dreaded comparison. Non-human animals are thought of and treated similarly to humans during periods of slavery and genocide, and the oppression and slaughter of non-humans is as unethical and immoral as that of humans. I don't know if that's what this gentleman meant, but that's how I determine. I'm sure that's my perception. But this gentleman made a connection that fuels my activism. It's a connection that I don't like to make outside of my restricted activist circle, which is mostly white people, because as a middle-class Euro-American woman, the potential to